Today, we're looking at a corporate entity so massive and so unprecedentedly powerful that it literally engineered the very architecture of the global capitalism we live in today. In this explainer, we're going to trace the dramatic rise and the really spectacular fall of the Dutch East India Company, or the VOC. We are talking about the world's very first true corporate superpower.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Back in 1614, Jan Pieterszoon Coyn, who was the VOC's de facto chief executive out in the East Indies, wrote this incredibly chilling directive. He stated, "We cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade." It's a stark statement, but it instantly establishes the highly militarized, deeply consequential reality of early global commerce that we're going to be unpacking today.
Act 1. Birth of a mega-corporation. Formed in 1602 through a government-mandated merger to fight off Spanish and Portuguese influence, this behemoth grew to a scale that is, honestly, almost hard to fathom. $7.9 trillion. According to financial estimates from our sources, that is the modern equivalent value of the VOC at its absolute peak. To put that massive number into perspective, that's roughly equal to the combined modern gross domestic products of Germany, the United Kingdom, and Spain. It represents a concentration of wealth that is just historically unprecedented. But, the VOC wasn't just insanely wealthy, it was uniquely powerful. That 1602 charter actually granted the company quasi-sovereign powers. They were legally permitted to wage war, conduct military operations, negotiate binding treaties with foreign powers, strike their own coins, establish overseas colonies, and even imprison and execute convicts. It was designed from the ground up to act much more like an independent colonial state than a mere trading company. Act 2. Inventing modern corporate finance. To actually fund this massive global military and economic complex, the VOC leaned heavily on some incredibly sophisticated, civilized financial engineering happening right in Amsterdam. See, before the VOC, maritime expeditions were funded strictly on a voyage-by-voyage basis. The VOC changed everything by pioneering the joint stock company with permanent capital. This meant shares could be bought by the general public, and crucially, that capital wasn't just liquidated after one trip. In August of 1602, 1,143 investors participated in what was essentially the world's first initial public offering, raising millions of guilders and allowing the company to engage in long-term strategic growth.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because this initial innovation sparked a breathtaking pace of financial evolution. 1602 gives us that world's first recorded IPO. Then by 1611, the Hendrik de Keyser Exchange opens up in Amsterdam, creating a secondary market to actually trade those physical shares. In 1613, we see the very first corporate insurance contract being drafted to manage their vast maritime risks. And by 1617, limited liability is officially established for the company's directors. So in just 15 short years, the VOC essentially birthed the modern stock market.
What we're looking at with this archival document is a financial manuscript detailing the complex mechanisms of bills of exchange in Bengal. And it really serves as the historical smoking gun of the VOC's vast bureaucracy. It shows us exactly how company employees were successfully moving massive amounts of wealth and managing cash flow across the entire globe, literally centuries before digital banking was even a thought. Further documenting this complexity, this manuscript shows Dutch directors actively negotiating bills of exchange through Anglo-Dutch banking firms. Looking at these documents neutrally, they perfectly illustrate the highly sophisticated and sometimes, unauthorized, transnational financial networks that sustained the VOC's sprawling operations. Act 3. Monopoly, War, and Violence. Now, we really must pivot sharply away from the refined trading floors of Amsterdam to look at how the VOC actually enforced its monopolies on the ground over in Asia. To maintain its edge, the VOC amassed a private military force of unprecedented scale. By 1669, they commanded 150 merchant ships, 40 dedicated warships, 50,000 employees, and a standing army of 10,000 professional soldiers. They possessed absolute maritime supremacy, and it was entirely enforced by a transnational network of mercenaries. And this brilliantly illustrates the fundamental historical duality, really the two faces of the organization. On one side, over in Europe, the Amsterdam Exchange, characterized by civilized financial engineering, consistent shareholder dividends, and regulated markets. But on the other side, in the East Indies, savage colonial violence, private mercenary armies, and unchecked territorial conquest. The massive wealth generated back in the Republic was inextricably tied to an immense human cost overseas. The historical record of the Banda Islands conquest between 1609 and 1621 provides a very stark, factual example of this operational strategy. When the local islands resisted a total VOC monopoly on nutmeg, the Dutch launched devastating punitive expeditions. The result was the near destruction of Bandanese society. According to historical accounts, 2,800 locals were killed, mostly from famine due to naval blockades, 1,700 survivors were enslaved to work the nutmeg plantations, and another 1,000 were forcibly deported to Batavia. This was the exact kind of calculated coercion utilized to secure commercial dominance.
Act 4. Perished under corruption. So, the crucial point is no empire lasts forever. When we map the VOC's actual financial reality against its dividend policy, a fatal hubris really emerges. From 1700 to 1730, they're on a very secure footing, with steady, high payouts building healthy capital. But look closely at the period from 1730 to 1780. Profits plummet drastically, yet the directors decrease dividends only slightly. To pull this off, they actually draw down the Asian capital stock by 4 million guilders. Post-1780, amidst massive military debt, the payouts actually start to exceed earnings, forcing a reliance on short-term anticipatory loans. So these aren't just accounting errors, we're looking at a visualization of the fatal hubris that ultimately destroyed the company. A deeply multifaceted machinery drove that decline. We see a steady erosion of intra-Asiatic trade as English and French rivals start gaining ground. There's also this lethal administrative centralization in Batavia that caused massive shipping inefficiencies. On top of that, they suffered from incredibly high mortality rates among their employees. And then the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780 completely devastated their shipping lines. But perhaps most tellingly of all, there was endemic internal corruption. By the 1790s, a popular phrase emerged in Dutch, vergaan onder corruptie, which translates to perished under corruption. And incredibly, that forms the exact acronym of the company itself, VOC.
Act 5. The Legacy of Capitalism.
Bankrupt and crippled by totally insurmountable debt, the VOC was formally nationalized and dissolved on December 31st, 1799. But its institutional ghost ultimately left behind the blueprint for modern global capitalism. When we look closely at the source material, it's absolutely clear that every modern multinational corporation, every complex global supply chain, and every stock market mechanism is a direct descendant of the organizational and financial framework that was pioneered by the Dutch East India Company. Which brings us to a final, provocative thought to leave you with today. As we look around at today's modern trillion-dollar megacorporations, we really have to ask, how much of the VOC's DNA still drives the global economy? It's an absolutely fascinating question about corporate innovation, governance, and the lasting legacy of unchecked power that still resonates over 4 centuries later. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.